we'll attempt to find the true origin of the vampire. Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and consider supporting the channel through Patreon or PayPal. 1,000 thanks to all of my supporters. Bram Stoker, a great Irish writer, is most famous for popularizing the more modern conception of the vampire with his depiction of Dracula. Making very tenuous connections to Vlad the Impaler, the reality is that Bram Stoker's Dracula was based almost entirely on Bram's own imagination, not any historical figure. Bram had spent extensive amounts of time studying Eastern European folklore in preparation for writing his novel. Many texts had been circulating Europe since the 17th century, dealing with the question of vampires, with even the famous philosopher Voltaire weighing in on the existence of the creatures. John Polidori, an English writer, released one of the first influential works of fiction on the question with his novelette, The Vampire. Released in 1819, the vampire in his work is named Lord Ruthven, and he seems to have been a strong basis for Bram Stoker's Dracula. In The Vampire, however, much of the drama takes place in Greece rather than Transylvania. They both picture the vampire as seductive, elite, and intelligent, with a great desire to corrupt people before killing them. However, Stoker incorporates more folkloric elements into his tale and brings up the matter of God and of evil, which Polidori strangely ignores. But one interesting aspect seems to be that he incorporates the genuine idea found in Greek and Romanian folklore that the vampire in fact starts off as mortal and is therefore more akin to a witch or sorcerer. But for those of Central and Eastern Europe, at least during the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, vampires were not some interesting characters in fantasy or folklore, but were very real, at least in the minds of the people of the time. To really begin this investigation into the origin of vampires and the tales that inspired writers like Bram Stoker, it's best to start with the word itself. Vampire isn't a Romanian word, something which may be a surprise to some. The word for vampire in Romanian is actually strigoy, a name likely going back to the Greek strix, meaning screecher, referring to a screech owl, but in antiquity also referring to an ill-omened bird or a witch, giving us our first clue to ancient continuity. But the term vampire is actually derived from Slavic, and it is found for a word for a creature akin to a vampire in most Slavic languages, appearing as upir in Russian, and something similar in most others. Some have claimed that it was actually a Turkic borrowed word, but recently this theory has been largely discarded. It might have even been the other way around, where Tartars borrowed the word ubir to refer to a witch. It appears to be of Proto-Slavic origin, meaning something like flyer. And we can then look at the Romanian, Roman, and Greek strigoy, and how it refers to the owl, but in some cases also to a witch or a vampire. So vampire likely refers to a flying creature, and the strigoy also refers to a flying creature, specifically an owl. And so both of these, although different words, likely come from a very similar origin. We can compare this to the similar volcula in English, meaning the werewolf, from volk, meaning wolf, and dolk, meaning a pelt or hair. So wolf pelt or wolf fur, a slightly different construction, but with exactly the same meaning as Germanic werewolf, showing that this idea had an Indo-European root. In contrast, the vampire appears to be linked to sorcery and witchcraft. In some European cultures at least, a similar shared idea may have existed about a creature that took the form of a deadly nighttime bird. One important concept about the vampire in several iterations is that it consumes human blood or human flesh. Our most ancient sources that deal with the dead's need for blood is none other than Homer. In the Odyssey, Odysseus must travel to the land of the dead to obtain knowledge from the deceased seer, Tiresias. He likewise speaks to the ghost of his mother, Achilles, and Agamemnon. Before speaking to him, they must be allowed to drink the blood of a goat he has emptied into a pit. The blood gives strength to the spirits to recall their life and to speak with him, and they greatly desire it. It is in fact the blood which draws them there, like moths to a flame. Only Tiresias is able to recognize him and speak before drinking the blood, due to his exceptional abilities. The vampire likewise must consume blood to maintain its strength. This was not only a literary practice. Chthonic blood sacrifices were occasionally made to dead heroes, typically at the site of their graves at night. There was a widespread belief across ancient Europe that the dead still required food. The Bell Beaker Indo-Europeans were burying people with food as early as 2400 BC. The purpose of this food is sometimes thought to be symbolic, but if we look at the ancient beliefs and folklore that comes down to us, even from much later times, it's very likely that this food had a real purpose intended for consumption by the deceased person or their spirit. Romans would later leave cakes, grains, or give milk to deceased relatives, and it was thought their spirits were nourished in some way by these offerings. In some more extreme examples, there are holes bored through stones that cover the entrance to some tombs. In Ireland, we know from medieval accounts that sometimes food was actually passed through these holes as offerings to the dead within. From this general idea of pacifying the hunger of the dead, we don't have far to go to understand the origin of the vampire. The hungry dead were feared, for if not placated, they may decide to roam from their resting places and find something to eat. While the scene from the Odyssey concerns spirits, though exactly how spirits can consume blood is something of a mystery, there are figures like the Norse Draugr and various scenes from Gaelic tales which show the belief that the corpse itself rises and walks again. They dwell in barrows, and they have the potential to leave them. Like vampires, the Draugr can shapeshift, often into the form of a seal. They are able to enter people's dreams and prefer the night, though are not harmed by the daylight, and we will see neither are vampires. To destroy the Draugr sometimes requires it to be wrestled back to its grave or to be beheaded, as found in many later vampire tales. They were conscious, intelligent beings, not zombies, but they were attached to the physical corpse of a dead person. How ancient some of these beliefs are is impossible to say, but we do know with certainty that they, at the very least, predate any written records, and may even shape burial practice. Why is it that many were kept in sealed tombs beneath stones? Status certainly played a role, but the nature of the burial also serves as a type of prison for the corpse, more secure than simply earth. Sometimes strange practices have been uncovered, such as people buried face down, bound, or with heavy stones placed upon them, or even jammed into their mouth after death, showing a fear that these dead bodies may still pose some kind of threat. Roman and Greek sources say that Germanic and Celtic people used to go to the grave mounds in order to commune with the dead. They would sleep upon the mounds and receive dreams or visions from dead persons interred within, something reflected in some of the Old Norse sagas. The god Odin also communicates with the dead seers to obtain prophecy, for just like in the tale of Odysseus, the dead possess greater knowledge of things that have been and things that have yet come to pass. The dead possess great knowledge, and so the highly intelligent vampire is not an anomaly, but in keeping with similar beings across Europe.
Ego can't stop kids from using shirts to wipe their face. But these waffles are where we both agree.
Get your wins where you can when you Lego with Ego.
Picture this. You could be visiting Abuelita and distant relatives. On your father's side, in the motherland. The City Advantage Platinum Select card, you could be anywhere. Travel on. City Advantage.
The oldest Samhain, or Halloween tale known from Ireland, is that of Nera, who is dared to go in the middle of the night and put a loop around the foot of one of the hanged men who are still swinging from a tree outside. Criminals executed likely as part of a ritual sacrifice held the day before. Agreeing to the challenge, he does this, but the dead man speaks to him, demanding that he be carried to a nearby house for a drink. Nera has no choice but to comply, and when the dead man reaches the house, he drinks from all the buckets of water and slop that is within. Then he spits it into the mouths of the sleeping people inside, killing them with the drops of water from his lips. The tale says this is why one should never keep basins of water, slop, pails, or fire without sparing once you have gone to sleep, for the walking dead may well enter your house and use it to kill you. Unfortunately, there isn't much we can do with modern toilet design. Maybe ensure you close the lid on that thing before sleep, especially on Samhain. With Draugr and the Gaelic Revenants, there is a sense that they spread disease and sickness, death perhaps linked to the corruption and uncleanliness of the dead. Knowledge of germs is modern, but ancient peoples were aware that unclean things were associated with sickness and death, and various ritual practices also came to express this. The idea of purifying oneself from wrongdoings is often carried out with some type of physical cleansing ritual in pagan traditions. Even in Christianity, the baptism with water symbolizes this ritual cleansing, which removes one's sins. Evil manifested in various forms spread disease. Sickness often became worse at night, in the dark. Flu season begins with the onset of winter and longer periods of darkness. Crops die off in the winter. The sun loses its strength in the winter. And so all of these things get linked and form the basis of a dualistic notion of the cosmic cycle. Though the vampire may have had similarities to these other European undead beings, they also had their particularities. The Greek name for the vampire is Vrikolakas, but this is not Greek in origin but Slavic. But it doesn't actually mean vampire. Vrikolakas has the same origin as Volkolak. It means werewolf, not vampire. Confused? In some Slavic regions, like Croatia, the word is also used to refer to a vampire. This is likely due to a similarity between both, which we postulated earlier when looking at the etymology. One figure associated with owls and flight, and another with wolves. In later times, in some places, these separate figures become one, or mixed and matched. This shows up in some vampire literature where vampires are said to also transform into wolves and bats, effectively combining both werewolf and vampire into a single creature. The Greek vampire also does not drink blood specifically, but will devour human flesh. They also appear linked to the spread of disease or plague, unexplained ailments, or sudden death, as in fact many vampires are. Historical accounts of vampires from Moravia, now part of the Czech Republic, say that they might appear to people they knew in life shortly after their death, and the person who saw them would die within a few days. If their bodies were dug up, they would still appear soft, colorful, and undecayed, but would smell terrible. If someone was suspected of being a vampire, the body was dug up, examined, and if they were undecayed, they would be beheaded, staked through the heart, and then burned. Such accounts are also related in Hungary and Romania. In one case, the victim's father, who had been dead for 10 years, sat down at the table with him, and he was dead the next day. The body of the father was exhumed and found to be in perfect condition, with blood like that of a living man. The corpse was beheaded. In another case, a man rose up after being dead 30 years and killed his brother, his brother's son, and their servant by drinking their blood from the neck, which killed them on the spot. This vampire was ended with a spike through the temple. From the region of Transylvania, the historical accounts say that vampires could drain the blood of the living, like leeches, and fill themselves on it, until they were so full that the blood would pour from their eyes and seep from the pores of their skin, making them absolutely bloated with blood. Sometimes those who have been sucked by a vampire will also become a vampire in death, although that is not guaranteed. At least one individual hoped to cure himself from vampirism by eating the dirt of the vampire's grave, but to no avail. He still became a vampire after death. He was staked through the heart and let out a terrible scream, and then his head was cut off and the entire body consumed by fire. In the 16th and 17th century, they began to perform this upon anyone who died whom it was suspected may turn into a vampire, so that they might put an end to the vicious cycle. When a few years later a young girl died of vampirism and cited seeing the dead child of a local man, it was found that they hadn't considered that if someone consumed the meat of a cow which had died of vampirism, they would also become a vampire. The body was dug up, found to show all the signs of vampirism, and was beheaded, staked, and burned. Then they dug up 40 other bodies, 17 of which showed signs of vampirism, and carried out the remedy. These actions in Romania were all done under the law, with judicial sanction. Laws on the books in the region laid out legal procedures for dealing with vampires, and professionals did exist that specialized in it, what we might call vampire hunters. For the situation gets more complicated even once living vampires get into the picture.
Grammarly makes communication at work one click simpler. Whether you're looking for a new job or you love the one you have, Grammarly can help you communicate with confidence. Concise writing means fewer miscommunications. Grammarly can help streamline your message so it reads loud and clear. We can even check the tone of your emails to help you build relationships at that new dream job. Congrats! Grammarly, better writing made one click simpler.
The strigoy does not only refer to an undead vampire, but also to a living witch or sorcerer, some of whom at least send out their spirits during the night to drink blood. Though most often associated with Romania, the strigoi are also known in many other Romance languages. Striga in French refers to a bird woman who sucks blood. The stregonine in Italian refers to a witch or sorcerer. Greek has strix. The name is even found in Polish, which must have been borrowed from a Latin-based language sometime in the Middle Ages, and refers to what is usually a female demon or vampire-like creature. But it was the Romanian strigoi and its specific myths that Bram Stoker most utilized for Dracula. He used the name vampire because it was a more well-known term in English, and because in many places there wasn't much, if any, difference between a strigoi and a vampire, with the terms often being used interchangeably. However, there does appear to be several differences. In many cases, except in Romania, the strigoi is more often female and refers specifically to a witch, while vampires in many Slavic regions do not specifically drink blood, consuming human flesh instead, or simply killing the victim without touching them at all, something common to all vampire tales. The specific drinking of blood, or drinking of blood from the neck, is something recorded in a minority of tales. When the witch or sorcerer strigoy dies, they would reanimate and become even more powerful, but someone might become a strigoy in a number of ways, through an unholy life, through improper burial practice, through a curse, and of course, by having their blood sucked by another strigoy, in many cases, or by being killed or coming in contact with a strigoy. Male vampires in Balkan countries were also thought to seek out the love of women, motivated by strong sexual desire, a theme that comes up in Dracula and even earlier fictional vampire tales. The union of vampire and mortal woman could actually result in children who would become a dampir, who some thought would gain certain abilities of vampires without becoming one. In Romania, there are likewise the moroi, children of the strigoi, with normal women. They would be born hideous and with a great amount of hair. The full extent of the powers of the real tales of the vampire shift a little over time and depends on the region. However, one thing you can be sure about: if you find yourself under attack by a real vampire, daylight is unlikely to save you. The vampire generally has a preference for night, but there is nothing to stop it from appearing at high noon or walking in and sitting down at your breakfast table uninvited, perhaps making you its meal. They could take many different forms, but they varied widely in their intelligence, with some being very smart and others being more like drones. Often people are made ill or die from vampires without the creature even touching them or draining their blood. Simply seeing the thing is enough. It's sort of like foretelling one's death. However, unless you are related to a vampire, you are not nearly as likely to be attacked by one, because in the surviving accounts, they generally went after family members, often those closest to them. The vampire is also prone to a strange OCD-type behavior found in other beliefs about the dead. So if one fills the grave with many pebbles or other small objects, they would be forced to count them. Iron could ward them off as well, as it does with fairies and the Gaelic Sidhe. Garlic, of course, is a staple, and will provide a shield of scented protection, and big stakes to trap the dead beneath the earth are always a good idea. One thing that I do not believe was ever fully worked out, however, is if the vampire truly rose from its grave, the soil would clearly be disturbed. How the vampire gets out and then returns to its grave again is very mysterious. This led to some postulating that they took the form of mist to get into and out of their graves. All of these curious abilities make the vampire something between a ghost and a ghoul. It isn't entirely physical, and yet at the same time it is physical. This point was one avenue of criticism that skeptical church officials and scholars used to try and debunk the obsession with vampires that exploded in the 17th and 18th century. The Catholic Church at the time seems to have largely denied the existence of vampires, calling the belief in them pagan superstition. In my own view, it seems that the idea of the vampire becomes conflated in some cases with the idea of a witch, establishing some unique characteristics but largely being influenced by the Slavic vampire. Romania is nestled among Slavic speakers and was ruled by various Slavic groups from time to time. Vlad the Impaler, often brought into connection with Dracula, is a good example of this, because his name Vladimir is clearly of Slavic origin, as are many other Romanian names.
Sauvage, Elixir, Dior.
But the strigoy, although their name originates from Roman strix, linked to the murderous witch and the ill-omened owl, but this has been combined with the Slavic undead vampire, which was perhaps earlier on much more like the Norse draugr and other such beings in European myth. And I think at least some of the deaths attributed to vampires appear more likely to have been caused by diseases. But why were people suddenly obsessed with vampires at this period of time? Because this was an exceptional circumstance. My hypothesis of why there was suddenly in medieval Europe this obsession about vampires had to do with the hungry dead. And that is that the dead were no longer being fed. People used to routinely leave offerings to their ancestors. They would visit their grave sites, pour libations for them, leave them small cakes or other things. But the church did away with these practices that had gone on in European peoples for thousands of years. And this cultural change might have caused great anxiety about the state of the dead and about how the dead thought about and would treat the living. And this is in fact why the dead always appeared to the relatives, because it is those loved ones who felt a kind of fear, trepidation, guilt even, so that the dead were not able to rest in peace, at least in the minds of their loved ones. Many people were convinced in the reality of vampires, so much so that they would dig up the graves of their relatives, cut off their heads, drive stakes through them. It is a gruesome task which someone isn't going to undertake easily. Some believe that the idea of the vampire began with people being buried alive. It is also the case that when people die or are killed on battlefields, their nerves and the contraction of muscles can sometimes cause them to sit up or move slightly, something terrifying to witness, very likely connected to the idea of the walking dead. Perhaps there are some vampires out there, but likely the majority of these past cases were the result of an idea and conviction that spread among people far more than vampirism itself. They became obsessed with this idea. It is a frightening warning about how far everyday people are willing to go to enforce an idea, dogma, belief, or ideology which has taken hold of their mind. Time and modernity has not made man more rational thinkers, but rather that he cloaks irrational beliefs in the guise of science or progress or any number of other things which he treats no differently in practice than those who dug up the graves of their fathers to cut their heads off and prevent another vampire attack. But what do you think? Are the vampire legends true? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to share your vampire stories with us all. Don't forget to give a like, thumbs up, subscribe, and as always, stand tall.
Growing your business is what it's all about. CubeSmart gives you the space you need to do it. Online or in person, we make self-storage as easy as possible. Say goodbye to crowded inventory and hello to your success story with CubeSmart.
In June 1462, a vast Ottoman army under Sultan Mehmed II advanced on the city of Targovishte in Wallachia. After weeks of grueling ambushes and pitched battles, resulting in thousands of Turkish deaths, the Ottomans were preparing for a siege of the Wallachian capital. But when a detachment of Ottoman cavalry was sent ahead of the main force, they encountered a sight that shook them to their core. They discovered a forest of impaled bodies. There were over 20,000 Ottoman captives rotting in the summer heat before the walls of Targovishte. The forest of stakes stretched for 2 miles in a vast crescent up to half a mile wide. This macabre sight was more than the Ottomans could take. The scale of the horror, the astonishing extremism of it, broke their spirit, and the Sultan and his army retreated from Targovishte. The architect of this horrific victory was Vlad III Dracula. His cunning, his military brilliance, and above all his extremism had saved his country and his people. But these very traits, the extremism of Vlad the Impaler, his willingness to do anything, to go further than anyone else to achieve victory, and his refusal to compromise, would ultimately mean his downfall. This is the incredible story of Vlad the Impaler. Vlad was born sometime between 1428 and 1431, the son of Vlad II Dracul. He was born into a time of great conflict between the Christian kingdoms of the Balkans and Central Europe and the Ottoman Turks, who were determined to conquer them. Vlad was born into a Wallachian aristocracy called the Boyars. The social structure of Wallachia was quite simple. There were the free peasants who worked the land, the boyars who ruled over them, and above them all was a prince known as the voivode. There was no simple succession between the voivodes of Wallachia. Legitimate rulers had to be of the royal line, ultimately descended from Basarab I, but none served for very long, and there were many usurpations by brothers, cousins, and bastard sons of the two main factions. The great enemy of the Draculeshti faction was the Daneshti. The succession was, in practice, about who was the strongest, and this often came down to who could retain the support of external allies. Because Wallachia was squeezed between larger, more powerful kingdoms, Vlad's father, as voivode of Wallachia, simply had to submit to one overlord or another, namely his mighty neighbours, the Kingdom of Hungary to the north, or the Ottoman Turks to the south. To understand Vlad the Impaler, we must first look at the actions of his father, the choices of Vlad II Dracul, his allies and enemies, and the horrific manner of his death would all have a profound impact on the character of his son, Vlad III Dracula, and the often extreme actions that he took in his life. To become voivode, Vlad II had courted the powers of Central Europe, especially the Kingdom of Hungary. In fact, this was where the famous name of Dracul, meaning dragon, came from. The Order of the Dragon was a chivalric order created by Sigismund of Luxembourg, who was King of Hungary and eventually Holy Roman Emperor. Its primary purpose was to defend Christendom from the Ottoman Turks, and Vlad II, as an ally of Sigismund, was welcomed into the order. Becoming known as Dracul, this name was extended to his sons in the form of Dracula, and his clan, his descendants, would become known as the Draculeshti. But when Sigismund died in 1437 and Hungary was weakened, Vlad II sought instead to ally with the Ottoman Turks to the south. The Ottomans always threatened invasion across the Danube, and without Hungarian support, the Wallachians had no hope of resisting. And so Vlad II travelled to the Ottoman capital at Edirne, formerly the Byzantine city of Adrianople, to pay homage to Sultan Murad II, and where he agreed to pay an annual tribute and to provide military support to the Ottomans in their coming attack on Hungary. Allying with the Ottomans seems rather to go against his oaths to defend Christendom from the Muslim Turks, but this was the reality of ruling Wallachia. Protecting your own position, keeping enough of the boyars on your side, and ensuring your peasants were not wiped out in an invasion was a balancing act where every decision had potentially terrible consequences. To openly defy the Sultan would have meant the invasion of Wallachia, thousands of Wallachians killed and taken as slaves, and Vlad's own death and replacement as voivode by a boyar rival who was willing to make peace. And so Vlad II tried to play both sides as best he could, but after supporting an Ottoman attack on Hungarian Transylvania, he was paid a visit by one of the great men of the age, John Hunyadi. The Transylvanian Hunyadi, as one of the most powerful nobles of Hungary, was the leading opponent to Ottoman expansion, and would be at different times a terrible enemy and a staunch ally to both Vlad II and Vlad III. And now in 1440, Hunyadi, who would soon be regarded as the greatest military commander in the Balkans, and was already a noble of great influence in Hungary, decided to bring Wallachia back under Hungarian control using both the carrot and the stick. In the next Ottoman invasion of Transylvania, Vlad II supported Hunyadi. And when the Ottomans were crushed, the Sultan demanded Vlad come to Edirne to explain himself. To defy the Sultan's order would have invited an invasion of Wallachia, and so in 1442, Vlad went down to Edirne, where he was immediately seized and imprisoned by the Sultan, along with his two young sons, Vlad, who was between 11 and 14 years old, and Radu, who was about 7 years old. Now, Vlad II had been well aware of the risks of putting himself in the Sultan's hands, and so he left his eldest son behind to rule in his absence. Mircea II was only about 15 years old, and as his father and younger brothers were now Ottoman captives, he could not side with Hungary against the Sultan. Because of this, Hunyadi invaded Wallachia, deposed young Mircea II, and made Vlad II's cousin Basarab into the voivode of Wallachia in return for his support of Hungary. After about a year, Vlad II was released by the Ottomans, and he returned to retake Wallachia, making himself voivode once more with the support of his son Mircea and the Boyar faction that had remained loyal to them. But Vlad was forced to leave his two young sons behind as hostages of the Sultan, and they would remain there for about 5 more years. Vlad the Impaler, the great and terrible enemy of the Turks, was in fact partly raised by them and educated and instructed by Ottoman tutors. But what was his life like as a hostage of the Sultan?
My role is a bit of matchmaking.
Exciting and new.
It is finding love on the high seas.
Come aboard.
I get to watch them walk off with the love of their life.
We're expecting you.
I'm here for real love.
Rebecca Romaine and Jerry O'Connell host The Real Love Boat, departing Wednesday on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
Before his time in Ottoman captivity, Vlad's childhood had been perfectly pleasant. He had joined his mother, his 2 legitimate brothers, and his father when they all went to the Wallachian capital Targoviste in 1437, and there young Vlad began his training as a knight. He was taught how to fight with the sword, the bow, and the lance, and he excelled especially at horsemanship. He also learned Italian, French, and Hungarian, as well as Latin for international diplomacy. The religion of the boyars was Orthodox Christianity, but Roman Catholicism had an influence too, and because of the influence of Catholic Hungary on his father, young Vlad was also instructed in the Catholic faith at an early age. The schism between Catholic and Orthodox Christians in Europe was for some people a greater concern than the struggle between Christianity and Islam, and this schism was extremely important in the politics of the region. When Vlad and Radu were raised by the Ottomans, their education as princes continued because the Turks intended for them to be potential vassals when they came of age. There was therefore no attempted conversion to Islam. That would have been counterproductive. The Turks wanted to produce tame Christian princes who would deliver a principality along with its taxes, produce, and slaves for the Sultan. Vlad did become fluent in Turkish, and he had contact with the future Sultan and his great enemy, Mehmed II, who was just a few years younger than Vlad. We can only imagine the details of their relationship. In some ways, they had a similar character, and both would become lifelong soldiers. Both would attempt to centralize ever more authority under themselves at the expense of their nobles. Although the future Sultan would have a vast empire to command in his endless wars of conquest, while Vlad would have to fight repeatedly for his throne and in defense of his people. Vlad chafed under his Turkish captors and was whipped frequently as punishment. No doubt this, along with the frustrations of his captivity, had a lasting emotional impact. It was rather different for his younger brother, Radu, who in later life would be known as Radu the Handsome due to his exceptional good looks. And by all accounts, he had a far more accommodating nature than did Vlad. And he became a favorite of Mehmed II. He was a few years older than Radu. As Sultan, Mehmed II would have 5 wives and 4 children.
Okay, guys, that's the vampire content. We'll be back with Frankenstein and the continue of the Valli Halloween countdown. A lot of people in the sector, there's no content here. A lot of people don't have absolute no content at all. So we're going to mix it up a little bit. Shout out to DQ, Precious Pete, everybody that pulls up. This was the content side of things. Yeah, and check out my video from 8 days ago, guys. I didn't even know. I just found out it got 1.8K on a live. It was Halloween live, actually. So make sure y'all go check that live out that I did at 1.8K. Hey! So y'all stay tuned, man, and just, get it together. Get some content going, put something together for yourselves, revamp y'all channels a little bit, and move on. Grow. Continue to move forward. We're moving forward into 2023. Understand it's the 4th quarter. Let's go, y'all. Salute to all y'all. Let's get some content going. It's fine. We're going to have the vampires. We're going to have Frankenstein, and we're going to break down some more things. Just stay tuned to this Halloween countdown. Hey! It's Valli. Stay mad, y'all. Please stay mad. And y'all watching. Y'all definitely watching. Got y'all dizzy.